Well, we thought it'd be fun to kind of at the end of the day here, while we're having a few drinks, to we talked kind of about a lot of stocks, and it would be interesting to maybe be a little bit more informal, talk with everyone about their background, why they got into investing, what brought them here today. So we added a few people here to the stage. Scott Miller, who I described earlier, with Greenhaven Road. Advisor to Willow, a friend and advocate on behalf of Willow, and he's been a great resource for me personally as well. Thomas Braziel, who's a director at the parent company, Fireside, also runs VP Capital, like I said, managed accounts as well as still kind of in the fund structure. He came all the way here from London, so we appreciate you coming out. And right now, Brian Stout as well. He's here right now. And other areas that Brian went back to supports Thomas. And I should also mention Tom Catholic, who supports Memoirs as well. So kind of wanted to kind of go through just a few things. What's the background is, how you first got interested. You don't have to kind of go around the circle, but Keith. We started 20 years ago or so. You mentioned seriously investing. Where did that come from?
I've always been somewhat interested in investing. My background was I started out as an electrical engineer. Went to small school, upstate New York College, engineering degree at the Air Force for 6 years, did a satellite acquisition down in Los Angeles, and was basically always interested in investing, but then when I got back to my MBA at UCLA and started doing business appraisal, I've been that the past 15 years. And then what I noticed when I was doing business appraisal, which was primarily back in private businesses and other stuff, basically back in companies, were primarily tax and financial reporting and other purposes, was that I noticed there was some interesting public companies also that seemed to be mispriced. And so as a result, I started doing some of my own investment on the side. I was starting around 2000 and just continued that through 2017. That's been my sort of background and interest from that perspective. Oh, thanks.
Hey, Jay, do you want to, and we've already heard from Geoff, but it'd be interesting to hear from Scott and Thomas as well.
Yeah, so I guess my background is also a little non-traditional, like it seems we tend to attract at Willow Oak. I grew up in a pretty blue-collar family. Didn't know anyone who had any kind of investment portfolio or stock ownership of any kind. But I remember in 1999, UPS went public. And that was a big deal for my family because my dad was a UPS employee and had been so since the 70s. And had accumulated some shares over that time, being that it was an employee-owned company. And he was pretty excited when his shares that had a cost basis of around 25 cents closed at $99 on the first day of trading. Not a bad return for a guy who didn't know much about the market, and I thought that was pretty cool. And it was 1999, and everything tangentially connected to the internet was just going wild. And I thought, well, why doesn't everyone just put all their money into tech stocks? That's clearly the way that you get rich. And I was only 14, so I lacked a little bit of understanding about the way things worked. But clearly, even at that time in my life, the stock market was pretty exciting. And so went to college, studied finance, happened onto the world of value investing, and read a book called What Works on Wall Street. And it really made it clear to me that if you want to generate great returns over the long run and you're willing to stomach some volatility along the way, it kind of makes sense to really direct your portfolio toward the out-of-the-way, least popular, lowest valued stocks, and that might work out well for you. And so graduated with a finance degree, went to work for Bank of New York Mellon, and was in the wealth management department, much like Andrew. I'm very familiar with that. And yes, it is an asset gathering game. And back in New York, no one treated me fine, but I was not interested in becoming a PM and going out 5 nights a week to the Pirates game or the Steelers game and shaking hands with people who I don't really care about. And just honest, I'd much rather devote my time to identifying investment opportunities. So I started writing online, otcadventures.com. Still exists. I still write there now and then. I'm a busier guy than I was 7 years ago when I started it. But I got attention in a hurry. It turns out there was a huge community of people really, really interested in discussing stocks that weren't being talked about anywhere else. And so I very quickly managed to develop a good following and a good list of collaborators and email partners and people who were just very, very intrigued by the stuff I was doing. And people would email me and say, hey Dave, I have an IRA that I don't have time to manage. Would you like to take a stab at managing it? And I'd say, well, I can't do that. I work for a large bank. The CFA Institute would be very unhappy if I didn't show my duty to my employer. But I'd say, well, if you ever go off on your own, email me, let me know. And that's exactly what happened. So I got the bug pretty early, and it just grew over years and years. And I'm a huge stock nerd today. That's really all there is to it. I wake up in the morning and start thinking about investing. And my wife will tell you that she has to say, Dave, come to bed. It's like 1 in the you're still reading about that company. And I don't know, it's just fun, what can I say?
Okay, hi everybody. Yeah, I think it's most people that are investors probably, I refer to it as a sickness. And it's nice that it's, and actually in being on the buy side and being able to invest other people's capital or your own capital is probably a good therapy for you. So for myself, I'm probably like most people here, which is, sort of always been interested in markets and in business. And, been at a lightning bolt when you sort of read certain things, whether it's Joe Greenblatt and the Buffett letters or anything that you've read in sort of formative years, and it's all sort of trial and error, and over time you build a philosophy and you sort of imitate in the beginning, and then you start emulating, and then hopefully over time you build your own sort of style, craft, whatever you want to sort of approach. And I think it's just similar. I mean, I focus on stress stuff, and most of it is not public. It's all sort of private, but it's not too dissimilar in the sense in the public markets you're sort of taking advantage of marginal sellers and buyers versus in our area it's more asymmetric information and also like forced selling and things like that. So So I've always been interested in investing, and I would probably do it if I made terrible returns. I would still do it. Not that So that's kind of
Not bad to follow. So my story is different. I grew up in New York City, and I had a friend who had a country house. It was beautiful, and they had a zoo at their country house. So they literally had zebras and alpacas and things I can't even remember, like super exotic animals. And you're like, what the hell did your dad do? Like, it was like, who has a zoo? And so, so I basically ended up reading a book that said what his dad did, market wizards, right? And so it looks at a dozen portfolio managers, and what was really interesting to me was the number of different ways that they made money. And it was just sort of problem solving, and it planted a seed. And so it took a long time for that seed to sort of formally gestate. There aren't a lot of sort of easy paths into money management, and ended up in the operating world for a long time, trying to build businesses. But while I was there, I was always kind of had a personal portfolio and was investing, and that was sort of where I was, I think, mentally and emotionally in a lot of ways.
Well, that's tough to beat. Names of the funds too is interesting. I mean, Tom's PE Capital, so that's focus compounding we heard from, but Alluvial, Greenhaven Road, Bonhoeffer Fund, Arquitos, back to Scott, where the name comes from. Does that have any meaning?
I live on Greenhaven Road. Is that personal enough?
It's not an unusual actual story. Many funds start that. I mean, Bonhoeffer Fund does have kind of a more historical meaning. So, Keith?
So the Bonhoeffer Fund is named after a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German theologian that was around at the time during the 20s and 30s. He basically was a strong Christian believer and basically set up a private seminary when it was illegal in Germany to train other believers basically to practice their faith when basically the Nazis were basically putting those people into concentration camps and killing them. Eventually he did end up dying in a concentration camp. He was part of the von Stauffenberg conspiracy, which basically was the attempt to kill Hitler in the 1943. He eventually sort of found everyone out, and he ended up dying in a concentration camp. I think the inspiration for me, for him, is basically, he was willing to basically sacrifice and do something different for a bigger cause. And a lot of times in the markets, that's sort of a similar kind of feeling that you get, especially if you're sort of a contrarian, you're doing things against what everyone else is doing and being able to stand up and making a difference. And I think that's the reason for the choosing of the fund's name, and that's sort of the inspiration for what we do with the fund.
And Alluvial, would you like to?
Yeah, so alluvial is an adjective that basically describes a landscape or a feature created by the action of water over time. I'm a native of Western Pennsylvania. I live in Pittsburgh, but grew up in various small towns, and a lot of the geography of Western Pennsylvania is glacial, created in the last ice age by advancing or retreating glaciers. And so I'm an outdoors kind of guy, and I've always appreciated the landscape, and I thought that alluvial was appropriate. There's also the fact that alluvial is close to the beginning of the alphabet, so I show up near the beginning of lists most of the time. And my last name is Waters, so there's a little bit of a pun involved. There we go.
What did you want to name your daughter? Is that something with Waters with the last name? But we talked about books, I guess, influences through books, and I'll throw one out to begin. The question would kind of be, is there a book that is a little bit less well known? I mean, we talked about You Can Be a Stock Market Genius, there's Margin of Safety by Seth Klarman, there's What Works on Wall Street and that type of thing, and these are the types of books that probably most of us have read and have appreciated, and they certainly had a big influence on us. But is there one that might be a little bit less well known that we can recommend to listeners? And I'm going to throw out the Memoirs of Benjamin Graham. I'm not sure very many people have read, and it's just a fascinating account. It's only partially has to do with investing, but it's more of Graham's life, his early life especially, and his way of thinking. It really shines through, especially during that time period. So I'm going to say the Memoirs of Benjamin Graham I highly recommend. And Geoff, since you haven't had a chance yet, is there anything that you can think of off the bat other than what you mentioned?
Yeah, I would recommend the book Hidden Champions, which is actually technically a business book, but I found stock ideas out of it, and Buffett always talks about wide moats. There's some wide moat companies that are really small, and that book's all about that. Hidden Champions.
It's a great book about a gentleman named Bill Zeckendorf, who's a famous real estate mogul who sort of made a bunch and then lost it all. And he wrote the book basically to pay his creditors. And it's a great account, and he really lays out almost like, he used too much leverage, but special situation, private investing in real estate. So it's very interesting to watch the deals he did. So it's called Zeckendorf, which is a great one. Another one is E.P. Taylor, which is a gentleman who's very famous Canadian sort of early roll-up during Prohibition. So during Prohibition, he was rolling up Canadian breweries that were very underutilized. It was basically one trade, and he's a billionaire off of one trade. It's the same idea, sort of rinse and repeat. So I love old biographies on business people through time. So those two are really great.
one I think is really interesting. It's a book called Ben Graham on Investing. It's basically a series of articles that he wrote for the Journal of Wall. I think it's Journal of Wall Street in the 1920s. So I have some of his first writings. And what's really interesting about it is you look at Ben Graham and he thinks both on the debt side, the equity side, and the preferred side. And he contrasts and goes through like all the different possibilities and ways of thinking about it. Because I mean, I think a lot of times now we sort of have different funnels. We have fixed income guys and equity guys, but this particular set of articles sort of goes across the capital structure and looks at different securities across the capital structure, when you should buy them, when you shouldn't buy them, and that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting, and it's much more. It's not quite as heavy as security analysis, but it's written in a really readable format. So I think that's a book I think is pretty interesting.
I said market wizards, and that's fine. And new market wizards. New market wizards.
Anything Jack Schwager related? Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question for Scott to kick off too. This idea of network effects as well. I think we've all benefited from being part of a network. I like the idea of having these kind of horizontal relationships. You get a vertical relationship from an analyst to portfolio manager or employee to employer, but to be able to have relationships kind of horizontally with peers, other portfolio managers, I found that's been a valuable way to get really honest feedback and honest advice that's a little bit less psychologically biased, for example. Especially with this group up here, I know we've talked to many of them and about different stock ideas, and there's not a predisposition to agree. We'd like to disagree, we'd like to challenge each other, we'd like to apply our different backgrounds and histories there, and so that's been very valuable to me as a portfolio manager. And I'd like to hear, especially from Scott and anyone else as well, kind of your experience as being part of that network, how it's benefited you as an investor and portfolio manager.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think depending on your style, I like to find companies that are, they don't screen well, right? You need someone, they need to be explained. There's something there, there's a twist, there's a riddle, there's a puzzle, and so, half the time I generally find that myself, and the other half it comes from what you call horizontal relationship. And so those have been incredibly valuable for me, and I try and do a bunch of things to kind of intentionally nurture them. And there's a gathering which some of the folks here go to, Value X Vail is great in terms of kind of to build those relationships. And I think you're asking me because I effectively created a fund it's called the Partners Fund, and part of that is about fostering relationships between myself and managers, and as well as between managers. And so we've convened folks and try and actively encourage people to work together, because that's the way we're going to do it. Look, we're all kind of one-man shows, maybe two-man shows, two-man plus Willow, however you want to do it, right? We're competing against folks that, I don't know, Pershing Square's management fees were, $90 million last year, right? And so we're not going to out-resource them, but we might out-clever them, we'll see. So to me, it's all about kind of those horizontal relationships.
Anyone else?
I think collaboration is an extremely important factor for the success of any investor. I think there's never been an investor who had zero intellectual blind spots or biases. And when you run your idea past another manager you respect and they say, "Are you sure about that? What about this?" You can do your research and say, "You know what, yes, I am really sure about that," or "You know what, I'm not." And that calls for more research, and you might end up changing your mind, and that's a healthy thing. And I enjoy the fact that I get to talk to other investors that I esteem, and I benefit from that in ways I would not have if I were all just doing my own thing in my own corner.
And that leads into this idea. I get this question occasionally about hedge fund hotel stocks, right? Because we generally are not universally, but generally we're looking at smaller companies, mid caps and below. And so if I happen to find one, you happen to find one, and we kind of follow each other into it, what's the risk there? Obviously there's a possible reward as well, but is there anything that people do to mitigate that risk? Or is it something that is just you haven't seen as being an issue so far?
It is something I worry about all the time because I feel that a lot of value investors do invest in the same sort of things, follow into the same sort of ideas. And it does worry me. To be honest, I mentioned computer services. It's pretty popular stock among a very small group of people. But, you know, you do your research, and if you think that it's cheap, you know, you'll buy it. But yeah, it's absolutely true that a lot of value investors follow each other into the same sort of ideas, yeah.
Thomas is immune from this because I don't think any of the rest of us have bought kind of Mt. Gox trade claims, anything like that, from the distressed debt side. But you know, my view is kind of similar. We don't have as much overlap, I think, as some people believe. I think there's certainly a similar philosophy, but when you get into the actual portfolio, I've not seen, and this is kind of part of Scott's network, and you know, a few people we have in the audience here that I respect that are other managers. You know, there might be one stock or something like that where there'd be some overlap, but it's just not quite as common. And I think, especially with Dave and Keith looking internationally, I mean, you're finding some companies that are just kind of probably outside of the universe of those of us who stick to North America. And, you know, next question into some of the psychological biases. The understanding is much greater. I mean, we know these psychological biases, some especially in the investing world because of Munger, and then, you know, eventually the behavioral psychologists and economists and things like that. Like a Danny Kahneman. And Kahneman has been pretty fatalistic about actually improving your psychological biases. And he's just kind of it's a fool's game and try to, you know, create your environment and operate within that, but understand you're gonna fall victim along the way. And I wonder if there are any tricks or environment kind of things that you create in your environment to mitigate some of those psychological biases.
I know one of my weaknesses, as I had mentioned before, is I'm pretty good sucker for a story. So what I try and do with all the companies that I invest in is I try to pull together sort of the quantitative numbers first and come up with what I think is a reasonable set of stories, as opposed to jumping right into having management or someone else tell me the story. I mean, it's sort of tough because a lot of investing in stocks is investing in stories, right? And so basically being able to try to pull myself away from someone that's a convincing storyteller, which I guess is sort of like what a lot of CEOs are sort of trained to be. That's how they became CEO for the most part. So there's some people that do that. So I think that's one thing.
So the confirmation bias, right? We look for, you know, things that agree with us, and so one thing that I've done for other managers, and some people do for me, is we call it red teaming, or Rudy from Desert Lion calls it the abominable no man, and basically there is you just get someone to just shit on your idea. I don't know if we can say that, but we just did. Literally tell me nothing positive. Find every negative thing you can about this idea. And that's a kind of helpful exercise, and you know, it's actually a gift when someone really just destroys it. And you know, oftentimes, you know, I still invest, right? Like, okay, I knew that, but I think it's a really helpful versus like the pat on it. I'd much rather have that, my idea just totally torn apart, than being like, oh, like it, that's good. So we try and actively encourage that happening.
I think it's important to work on expanding your, they say circle of competence, but whatever framework you want to use. Every investor has their little sandbox they're most comfortable playing in. They get used to a certain kind of stock or a certain segment of the market. It's important to force yourself to look outside that now and then, not necessarily for an investment idea, but just for the search for knowledge. We all get really, really used to reading the commentary and the outlook from certain managers and certain industry segments, and guess what? Everyone's talking their book. Do you think a company's really going to tell you that everything's awful and their products are obsolete and their customers are unhappy? But you might learn that. True. But you might learn that if you read a report from their competitor or from a competing industry that has a better technological solution. So I think it's about the quest for knowledge. I think when you get comfortable, you get complacent, and then someone else overtakes you.
In terms of like behavioral biases and watching after these things, cross-referencing of horizontal relationships is like the best way you can even do those things. You have guys that have a tech background, or they're interested in sort of compounders, or people that are special sit investors, and that you're just doing your deep value, and the special sit guy goes, well, I hope you really like the story because no one's going to buy it because this reason, that reason, that. So this kind of cross-disciplinary, those relationships with people that have a different perspective, maybe a credit perspective, maybe a deep value perspective is so valuable, and it can help you, with your behavioral biases, and increasing your circle of competence is the only way you're going to find fertile areas. Yeah, I mean, of course you're learning and your training goes on when you go in these new areas, but you have to sort of do that. I think part of our job as value investors in sort of 21st century is to take the ideas that sort of laid out and expand upon them, whether that means going to Norway, or that means going to sort of more compounders, or maybe that means going into South Korean prefers or whatever. So you're supposed to push the boat out, you're not supposed to mimic, just to emulate, not, so.
Any superstitions?
I won't wear red when the market is open. I wear red shoelaces, a little different, but that's my main one. No one else? You guys, you need some.
Yeah, I have a color one too. I think there have been studies done. You want to make decisions with a peace of mind and with kind of an uncluttered mind. And there's my office is a light blue, so you want a nice calming presence. And things like that. I don't know. I'll say another part of it, which isn't really superstition, but there is kind of the psychological bias aspect of decision fatigue. When you're reading, what time of day are you reading 10Ks? What time of day are you assessing kind of complicated ideas when you're doing research? And studies have shown that earlier in the day, maybe immediately after a nap and things of that nature, it's better to process things. And when you're reading through, for example, a fairly dense 10K, there are 1,000 little assumptions you're making along the way, and so you don't want to have a tired mind because as you're reading through there, you might just kind of make a lazy assumption that would feed into your predisposed bias of the company itself. So I like the idea of having that, reading through things, important, complicated things, when you have a fresh mind earlier in the morning. I think there was a study I read, it was the worst time of day to actually make a decision. I think it was like 2:12 p.m., something like that. So you want to don't do anything at 2:12 p.m. each day. That's when your mind is at its worst. So it's a little bit of a sense of superstition, but backed up by a little bit of science, unlike the red.
Do you want that on your screen?
I don't, no. From there, I guess, a little bit of advice for maybe other fund managers, looking back at the launch of the fund, and if you don't mind, we'll go through each one. Geoff might be a little premature here, but maybe you can talk about it with the managed accounts. Going back to the very beginning of launching the fund, is there anything you would do differently, or is there something that you think that you did very well that you might want to know?
I guess the one thing that I did that wouldn't necessarily do differently. It's really sort of out of my control. What I've seen some people do, and I know this is tough, is that if you can start your fund when your style is sort of out of favor, as opposed to start it when it's super in favor. But I think eventually it's going to come back. But I think that's one thing. If you have a choice in terms of timing when you start versus not, which I think some people may. But I think the key thing in terms of starting a fund is just going off and doing it. I think to a certain extent you want to, if you've got a set of sort of ideas or concepts. I think what I've sort of done in terms of starting Bonhoeffer is basically sort of thinking through, okay, these are the kind of stocks I like. Is there some common thread or some common thing that sort of ties these things together and gives you a theme, and that may at least provide a way to sort of explain your specific style of investing to other investors. Because one of the things, this business is full of tons of funds out there, and one thing you want to clearly think through is how can I differentiate the offering that I'm going to offer versus someone else. And I think trying to think through what are sort of the commonalities, the themes that you have. And I think each one of the managers here you've seen, they sort of have thought through and can sort of communicate what that difference is, provides a differentiation for you to go out and have people get excited about what they're investing in terms of fund.
You know, I mean, for me, it's the operational matters. I started Arquitos Capital in 2012, and you know, not having come from Wall Street or that background, I was a lawyer. Just what service providers, what type of infrastructure is necessary, what are the marketing materials, you know, what's kind of the process to attract investors, and what type of kind of operational assistance do you need? And it took a few years to figure all that out, the best practices with certain service providers. And you know, so that's something that was a little bit of the genesis of Willow Oak and the fund management services was my experience going through that, as well as some other peers who started at the same time. Jeremy Deal, for example, who's on the board of Enterprise Diversified, went through the same thing in 2011, and we talked about that quite a bit. And so, you know, that's the problem we're trying to solve through Willow Oak Fund Management Services. And I think if you know, it started today, I would probably team up with somebody who does offer operations to make sure that I can stay focused on the portfolio, because I spent so much time in the beginning kind of being distracted.
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. I would have started earlier, right? I mean, I just wish I had taken the plunge earlier, but I didn't. And the operational, you know, I partnered with a group called Stride about 4 years in that is very similar to Willow Oak. It's hard enough to find the good ideas, and I mean, I don't know if any of us love compliance or onboarding investors or tax returns or, you know, like any of these other pieces and stuff. You do it because you love investing. And like, to me, the downside of Willow Oak or someone like that is they take some of the economics. And, well, you care about them taking the economics if it's wildly successful, so, like, good problem to have. And by the way, your chances of being wildly successful are increased if you're not doing it totally alone, right? You're more likely to get people to commit capital, you're more likely to be able to devote time to invest, et cetera. So, I mean, it just makes sense to me.
Well, if I had to do the managed accounts, start them over again, I'd say you're all using the same broker no matter what. You're not picking different brokers.
I'd say that no matter what, stay humble. It feels great to launch a fund. Oftentimes, it's the culmination of years of work, and especially if you get off to a hot start, you can start thinking, I'm really, really good at this. And that's so dangerous. Because usually that's when you get sloppy, that's when you start making mistakes. So keep in mind that you're fallible, keep learning, and keep the appetite for improvement no matter what.
Good advice, good advice. In terms of launching a fund, just to knock on to double down or echo the operational stuff, more than half of hedge funds close because of either operational or issues at the GP, a lot of it around administration. I don't know if that was a statistic, or I think actually it was a Goldman banker who's like their head of asset management and alternative asset manager, sort of investment banking. They try to see managers, and they had a very hard time. And a lot of the reasons break apart is can be operationally based, not necessarily investment return based, or investment and performance based. So that's, you know, having operational background and partnering with someone is really not a bad idea at all. And I don't know, any other advice in terms of launching a fund? No. Start sooner rather than later. You learn to invest by investing.
Yeah, I mean, with that, any kind of final advice? Any final advice to new managers, like in addition to what we may have mentioned already? And I'll just add as we pass it along here is, start as soon as possible whenever you feel comfortable. I mean, certainly you want to be as an individual investor and have success having done that. But if you can attract some friends or family that support you, and coworkers and things of that nature who might have seen your passion for investing, and you can start fairly cheaply with managed accounts. You can always make a transition. I think 3 of us have done that. I started with managed accounts as well and made the transition into the funds. So I would say get going. Don't let your background hold you back either. whether it's your occupational background or educational background or anything like that. I mean, to be these very, very, very successful fund managers typically have non-traditional backgrounds, and whether that's an educational or whatnot. Going up through as an analyst to a PM, it's sometimes they're successful, but more often they're not. And there's a big difference between being an analyst and being a portfolio manager. And then I think, when you look at the infrastructure, you have to right size it and make sure that you're able to survive at a certain AUM level. I mean, we've heard stories of some well-known portfolio managers who've had to close down, maybe because 1 or 2 down years or because their AUM is slid or something like that, because they have this huge infrastructure, so they cannot survive on $50 million of AUM. In New York, for example, whereas several of us, we started with less than $1 million. The idea of not being able to survive and run a fund at $50 million is ludicrous to us. And so, you want to run as lean as possible, which I think is great advice anyway, in the beginning, whether you need to or not, because you want to be mindful of the fund expenses, you want to be mindful of your business expenses, and make sure that you're creating a structure that can last forever. That's the idea. You want to run a fund for 40 years, then you don't need a staff of 3 or 4 people, in the beginning there. And have kind of this huge infrastructure internally, where if things don't go well, maybe you'll last 3 years instead of the 40 that you wanted. So any other advice kind of as the end of the discussion here?
For me? No, I was at
I thought you were asking for it, sorry.
What do you got? Good advice.
That's what I've been trying to do the whole time. No, I'd never recommend any fund. That's for everyone else to decide. Good advice, persevere. There's going to be, no investment strategy is hot forever. No investment strategy is cold forever, as long as it's based in fundamentals and backed by sound theory. And it's not fun to go through a down or out of favor time period for the strategy you follow. It's very, very challenging. It really makes you question. I mean, I've had mornings where I woke up and thought, am I a moron? Am I just stupid? And once I gather my bearings, that no, the market just doesn't like what I like right now. And that's okay. As long as I stick to what I'm doing and I have the right set of clients and partners who also know what I'm doing, I guess that's what I'd say. It's just as important as doing your research correctly and making the right decisions. You have to have a group of people who get that. You have to have a group of people behind you who will stick with you through the times when you're lagging the market or just totally out of sync with the market, and knowing that you'll eventually come around.
I'd say when I launched my fund, literally the only people that would give me money were myself, my family and some friends, right? So those are my choices. It was friends and family. The flip side is that ultimately, if you're going to build a real business, it's not going to be on friends and family. And so I would say choose wisely amongst the friends and family that you ask to partner with you. Recognize that they're doing it as much to help you as they are to hopefully make some money. And I mean, you can't replace your best friend from growing up. You can sour that relationship if things don't go well with the fund or you don't pay it properly. And so I'm just sort of mindful, I can't replace 30 and 40-year-old friends. And my business isn't going to be built on those. And so what I tried to do was only go to the people that I thought could appreciate what I was doing and could hopefully parse out kind of the results versus the process. And my term in my head was either the big boys or the people that wouldn't care. My parents are going to love me either way, right? Unfortunately, they weren't going to build my business, and then I had a few, of my uncles, I went to one, right? But I wanted to be able to preserve Thanksgiving. I wanted to be able to preserve, I have some recreational stuff I do. I just having to take money from those folks because that's my outlet. And if my business is contingent on raising money from people I play tennis with, I don't have a business. So I would just temper the friends and family.
Yeah, it's good advice. Some people can compartmentalize kind of relationships and money, but most people can't. So, with that, open to any questions. We have a few minutes. If anybody in the audience would like to ask a question of us, we're happy to do so. Otherwise, we can step out and have a drink for the next hour or so as well. Rob? Talk loudly. I'll repeat the question.
Scott, I was just wondering, how many animals do you have, and what's your largest animal?
Oh my God.
How big is your zoo?
We have 2 goldfish that are this big, and we have 1 dog.
You're keeping your costs low, right?
No zebras yet. Yeah, back, Chris.
Yeah, Scott, actually I have a question about the Partners Fund. I would love to hear your experiences so far. What you expected going in, what you ended up, learning about, and what you may or may not have done differently.
So the Partners Fund is a fund of funds that's focused on small managers. We're invested in 2 of the small managers up here, to my right. And the basic idea is that fund of funds are sort of a fundamentally challenged business, I think, and they're not designed to invest in small managers. For the fund of funds, for the economics to work for the manager of that fund of funds, they need scale. And if you have scale, you then don't invest in Bonhoeffer, quite frankly. Those 2 things are mutually exclusive, and basically, kind of around the horizontal relationships, my idea was that while the economics of a fund of funds are of the small fund of funds aren't great. My primary day job is I run a fund, Greenhaven Road Capital, and if I get a couple of good ideas that run through Greenhaven Road Capital, the economics of that are actually pretty good. So I think one of the things I want to avoid, quite frankly, and I think that there's so many smart investors out there. I mean, they're literally, this is just in one spot, and there are tons of them. And so for me, one of the challenges is on a look-through basis, you could invest in 30 people, no problem, right? But then on a look-through basis, you're basically recreating the S&P 500. Because each manager owns 15 funds, and suddenly you own 450 funds, and suddenly you're S&P minus some fees. And so that has been, I think for me, the tension has been to restrict it to a few enough people, a few enough managers, and then at the same time, actually, I do want to preserve relationships, right? And so most of what I end up doing is saying no to folks, which is managers are my peers, ultimately, and they're in fact people I want to have deeper relationships with. So there is a tension that I didn't totally see kind of going into the creation of the Partners Fund that exists there. And so, but I think the core strategy fundamentally works. The people that have the best chance to generate superior returns are people that are managing modest amounts of capital. Right? Now, not everyone who's managing almost no money has chances to generate returns, but if you find the right people, and I think that's part of what Willow is about, right? Find the right people, support them, and that can work, right? And we'll see if it works for the Partners Fund or not, and how well we choose, and there's an element of luck to it and timing and all that, but at the core, I believe that as much as ever. And I think the other thing, for me, with the Partners Fund, I can't in my own Greenhaven Road say, don't judge me on my monthly performance, look at me over a 3 and 5 year period, and then as an allocator be dude, you had a down week, those things don't go. So, we're going to see how it plays out. And my aspiration is to we're limited to 100 investors just by charter. So we're going to stop taking capital. And we're not going to really actively rebalance, right? Now, sure, if someone, at a certain point, we're okay, this didn't work, we'll take the money back. But for the people that it really does work, the way this works is compounding, and we want to really let that run, so we'll see.
Anything else? Bill?
I was wondering, do any of you guys out there feel the need to evolve your investment style more towards quality, more towards
Dave, I know you like tech companies 20 years ago. The question is, has there been a shift in kind of some of the things that you're interested in based on, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of based on whether valuation, other interest, the way that market's evolved here? Has it changed the things you look at or the things you're interested in?
Or is it necessary that you have to go look for the better businesses?
Do you feel like you have to, right? So, I mean, do you have to invest in Amazon because now that's considered a value investment, as an example?
I'm not a lot of stocks, but in terms of looking for quality, I think everybody, even when you're doing distressed, you're trying to find quality. I don't know what that means, paying up for, incredibly ridiculous valuations for growth-oriented companies. But I definitely think as a value investor is the shift from sort of the rise of intellectual property value, so it's not really on the balance sheet, it doesn't screen, it doesn't give you a net, but to at least appreciate, the fact that the company might have either a moat, externalities that reinforce the business, the stickiness, the customer switching costs, all these kind of, I guess, border five forces, but even further, just like economic characteristics that don't show up in the balance sheet, right? It's not just replacement costs, and you're buying below replacement. I think as a value investor, like at a time when software is eating the world, it's something you should take into consideration. I think it's more of a negative art, so it's about being more selective on value securities. And Bill, I know you do this, you're a manager, so it's like, let's be careful. I think it's more of a missing the buggy whips than finding the automobile company that's going to own the market. So it's more about, watching the mistakes in terms of technological change and not getting run over. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I agree about your comment about the negative filter. I think anyone can go out there and find a company that trades at a PE of 5, and that's great, but that's useless if the company's earnings are going to fall by 50% over the next 2 years because their end market is being eaten by a better solution that's from a faster, more nimble competitor. And I really do think that you've nailed it. The investors, I think, more than they were previously, are appreciating the value of network effects, of intangibles, of intellectual property, and any investor, of course, should be considering those things. I don't think that economic laws have been upended. I don't think that trees grow to the sky or that companies can operate forever with no threat of competition entering the arena, but I think it's well worth any investor's time to consider the competitive forces that affect their holdings.
One thing I've observed is I think technology is really sort of reaching a lot more companies than it used to, and the key thing is I think take a look at companies and how they're really being used, and are they actually being disrupted by that? And a lot of companies are being disrupted, but then the real question is, do they have a position, or can they react? Do they have a strategy to basically try to react? I mean, you've got a lot of these businesses that are being disrupted and the valuations are going down, but you need to really take a look at, does the company have a moat or something to try and protect itself from these threats? And I think that's probably the biggest change that's happened, and why probably screens don't work as well now is that you can get low PE companies, but these are companies that are basically being destroyed by technology or technology-enabled type of companies. And so the real question, you have to do like what Thomas and Dave says, you have to put a little bit more thought into it and say, okay, this is happening, and then to what extent do you think it's going to happen? Sometimes the market overextends that this business is going to be totally blown away, and it really isn't, because it has more moats. So I think a lot of it is just trying to think through these things and come up with what do you think are sort of realistic type of expectations going forward. And I think as much money can be made on the disruptors as can be made on companies that they think are going to be disruptive, but they're really not, because there's some aspects of the business. Examples that I can give that's happened in the 2000s was some of the radio companies, and even now some of the TV companies. Some of these companies that people think are going to be totally run over, but then when you look at the business characteristics, the characteristics of the businesses, they do have some resilient characteristics that may actually allow them to basically fight back, I guess. Because a lot of times in markets, incumbents have advantages, and so the question is do they have the tools and do they have the expertise to sort of fight back these new entrants coming into the market.
Great. With that, I think we should kind of wrap it up here. We've got some time to mingle, have some one-on-one conversations as well, and have a drink here at the bar. But I want to thank everyone up here on the stage for joining us here, and in the audience, as well as people who presented earlier today as well, Andrew and all of the Willow Oak staff. Thanks so much for being here. We appreciate you spending the day with us, and we look forward to the next event with you, and are excited about the future of Willow Oak and all of the funds and advocates affiliated with us. Thanks so much.